Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave. In this video, I want to look at Xenophanes of Colophon, a philosopher who lived between roughly 570 and 475 BC. He was originally from Colophon, an Ionian city not far from Miletus and Samos, but at the age of about 25, he packed up his suitcase and moved. And he kept on moving, as he was said to have lived in a great number of places, all throughout the Greek-speaking world, going at least as far as Syracuse in Sicily. He is also one of the earliest philosophers who left us some of his writing, but he did not write engaging prose dialogues like Plato, nor technical logical arguments like Aristotle. His style was much more in line with what Homer or Hesiod did, or Jewish prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah, because he wrote in a poetic style. Now, poetry is great and all, but it does make it a little bit more difficult, sometimes at least, to really grasp his meaning, especially if what is left of his writings is fragmentary. So even though we have some of his writings with us still today, we should be careful with our conclusions. So what do we know? Well, for one, he was not a big fan of people glorifying athletes, like sprinters or boxers. They were getting all these honors, he complained, but they don't provide any concrete benefit to the city. This must not have been a very popular opinion at the time, since sports were, as they are today, a big part of public life, and one of relatively few sources of entertainment that was available to everyone. And when you are critical of one thing in society, you are usually critical of other things as well. One very interesting aspect of his culture that Xenophanes was critical of was the popular religion. Now, he didn't seem to criticize people bringing sacrifices in temples or participating in the holy celebrations, but he strongly disagreed with the myths that were being told about the gods. Especially Homer and Hesiod were criticized. Homer, of course, wrote about the Trojan War, and Hesiod wrote about all sorts of myths. Xenophanes criticized them for how they described the gods, since they have ascribed to the gods all deeds which among men are matters of reproach and blame, thieving, adultery, and deceiving one another. Ouch, that hurts. But he goes even further than that, since he also said, mild racism warning here, Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and dark. Thracians that they are grey-eyed and red-haired. And he went even further than that, since he claimed that if horses had hands, or oxen, or lions, or if they could draw with their hands and produce works as men do, then horses would draw figures of gods like horses, and oxen like oxen, and each would render the bodies to be the same frame that each of them have. So not only should gods not have the same character as people, they shouldn't even be seen as having the same appearance as man. So he's a sharp observer and critic of some of the commonly held values and beliefs of his contemporaries. But what did he himself believe? And here, seemingly for the first time in Western thought, we have the beginnings of an epistemology. That is, a theory of how we can search and find the truth. The quote about this topic goes as follows. By no means did the gods intimate all things to mortals from the beginning, but in time, inquiring, they discover better. This means that we don't know everything there is to know when we are born. Nor are the things we think we know necessarily true. Many of our instincts could be wrong, and the gods are not giving us any insight in reality either. The gods did not walk among us, as the myths from the ancient poets describe, nor do they still talk to us by divination. All of that is nonsense, and that is not how we gain knowledge or understanding. Instead, we should inquire, investigate, ask questions, and then we will ultimately get better. It is often suggested that Xenophanes was the first to distinguish between knowledge and true belief. To give you an example of the difference, I know that I exist, but I don't know with the same kind of absolute certainty that Australia exists, I've never been there, sorry Aussies. I've only heard stories, seen pictures, etc. So I'm fairly certain that Australia exists. In fact, I'm willing to bet an awful lot of money on whether or not Australia exists. But I don't have an absolute and definitive proof that it does. So in a way, I only believe that Australia exists. This belief is true, so it is a true belief, but it is not knowledge. Now getting back to Xenophanes. What did Xenophanes believe about the world? And, more interestingly, about the gods? Well, to be honest, his science wasn't very impressive. We've seen more interesting theories with Anaximander and Anaximenes, for example. But he did have a few ideas of his own. For one, he believed that the earth was infinitely wide and infinitely deep, meaning it is not standing or floating on water or air, nor was it surrounded by anything. Also, the sun came into being from the fires that came up from the earth and then combined themselves into a fiery ball. He was also the first to comment about the fact that there are seashells on the tops of mountains, as well as fossils of fish and other animals. He had a complicated theory about how all of this came to be, but the main idea was that apparently these mountains, at some point, were underwater. And finally, onto a more meta level, he also had something to say about the fundamental basics of reality. It seems that he, along with Thales, believed that the arche was water. But it wasn't just water. It was water and earth, like wet and dry, the opposites of Anaximander. And that if you combine water and earth, then you can explain everything. But now let's move on to what is perhaps the most interesting contribution to philosophy. And that is the topic of theology. And here we get a couple of very interesting quotes. Earlier, Anaximander had talked about the divine substance called the Epeiron, and Pythagoras had claimed to have received mythical revelations from God. But Xenophanes gave us some interesting insights in his theology. There is one God, greatest among gods and men, not at all like mortals in form or thought. So God is completely different from human beings. And then here he says, whole he sees, whole he thinks, and whole he hears. So this God can see and hear and know everything. And about the nature of God he said, always he remains in the same state, changing not at all, nor is it fitting that he come and go to different places at different times. And then here's a quote about someone writing about Xenophanes. Xenophanes used to say that those who say that the gods are born are just as impious as those who say that they die, since either way it follows that there is a time when the gods do not exist. So to summarize, Xenophanes believed in a god who is not at all like humans, that is called a non-anthropomorphic god. This god is omniscient, meaning he knows everything, and he is unchanging and unmoving, and this god always is. And this leads to some interesting conclusions. First of all, Xenophanes introduced the idea of a new opposite, namely the opposite of being and not being, or existing and not existing. This will become very important later on. And then he says that since God is, he cannot change, because apparently there is something about being that prevents change. Now keep those things in mind when we discuss the next philosopher, since this story is not over yet. To stay up to date with my channel, follow me on social media, and also like, share and subscribe to my channel.